It's no secret that everybody would like to have younger players and younger assets on their team in Dynasty. When you're playing for the long haul, all things being equal, you'd much rather have a young player than an old player. Of course, because you think you have so much more time to capture points from a young player, whereas an old player, you're getting closer to the end of their career, their production can take a steep fall off, and then their Dynasty value absolutely goes out the window. Nobody really likes to have that much risk as far as age goes in Dynasty, and all that makes sense. However, there is some give and take here, and at this time of year in particular, in the summer, things can really start to swing, in my opinion, too far to the youth side, and we start to really lose sight of what is the importance of youth and what are we really trying to get here. And I want to talk about the quarterback position in particular today because I think there's a big fallacy right now with the quarterback position as far as overvaluing youth. If they're a great player, they can age more gracefully and you can have a much longer career from the quarterback position. So today what we're going to do is really go over the quarterback landscape in Superflex and Dynasty at the moment. And this really led me to 3 players that I feel we need to talk about because of what their value is at the moment. So let's get into all that. But before we do that, you already know what time it is. Let's tuck them, man. Tuck these damn shirts in. Stop yapping. Let's talk about some older QBs. All right, so we really got to talk about this. So what I want to do is just pull up startup ADP just for the sake of a visual so that you can see this as I go through the entire landscape. We're going to stop once we get to covering all the teams at their quarterback position. So we're going to get through 34 quarterbacks. The 101, you got Patrick Mahomes. 102, you got Josh Allen. 103, CJ Stroud. 104, Jalen Hurts. 105, Lamar Jackson. Then we get a little break until we get the 109, Joe Burrow. 110, Caleb Williams. The 111 is Anthony Richardson. So that's 8 quarterbacks coming off the board in the first 12 picks of startups. As you make the turn into the second round, you get Jordan Love and Justin Herbert at the 204 and 205, and then you get Kyler Murray at the 209. So there's only 3 quarterbacks going to round 2, and that makes a total of 11 quarterbacks in the first 2 rounds. You get Jaden Daniels coming off at the 302. The 304, you got Trevor Lawrence. The 307, Brock Purdy, and then the 309, you get Dak Prescott. As you go to make the turn into the 4th round, you get Tua Tagovailoa at pick 404. 409, you get Jared Goff. Then when you make the turn into the 5th round, we dip back into the rookie pool at the 503, JJ McCarthy, and the 504 is Drake May. And then after the 504 with Drake May, there is a giant gap until we get to the next quarterback in the 7th round. So no quarterbacks in the back end of the 5th round. All the 6th round, no quarterbacks again. We get to the 702, Bryce Young comes off the board at quarterback 20. And then at the 710, we got Kirk Cousins, and the 712, Baker Mayfield. Into the 8th round, we got Watson at the 803. We got Bo Nix at the 806. The 812 is Will Levis, Matthew Stafford. He's the only quarterback in the 9th. In the 10th round, we got Michael Penix Jr. coming off at the 1001, and then Aaron Rodgers coming off at the 1008. You got Justin Fields coming off at the 1102. The 1110, Geno Smith. 1301, Derek Carr. 1302, Daniel Jones. 1308, Russell Wilson. 1409, Gardner Minshew coming off the board at quarterback 34. Now, if you were to put ages to all the startup values, what's really interesting to me anyway is there's plenty of guys early on in drafts that are in the upper part of their 20s, and 30's really just around the corner for them. However, you got like Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen. These are elite players. Joe Burrow's at 27. So none of these guys we really feel like or define as old quarterbacks, right? They're all in their upper 20s or lower. The first quarterback to come off the board that's actually currently at the age of 30 is Dak Prescott. He'll be turning 31 in July. The fact that he's coming off the board at the 309 and quarterback 15, he is the first person in particular that I want to talk about. He's technically on the older side relative to a lot of the guys that are going ahead of him. But there's really only a few years separating him and a guy like Joe Burrow, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, and other guys going in front of him in startups. This is an absolute screaming value. If you were in a startup and you were going to wait on the quarterback position, getting Dak Prescott this late in the 3rd round, to me, is an unbelievable value that really just shouldn't be happening. And a lot of things with Dak Prescott, to me, that I'm assuming is pushing his value down is obviously the age of 30 and the fact that he is playing for a contract. If we take a look at a guy with a resume like Dak Prescott and who's accomplished as much as he has, 31 realistically to me is not that old. And especially at the quarterback position, it feels like age can become too much of a factor when people are baking in their Dynasty team. I'm really looking at my team in general in Dynasty with a window of 2 to 3 years tops. Trying to project your team and age much past that really doesn't seem all that prudent because the reality is in 3 years, so much can change. And to worry about solving a position past 3 years, seems like you're getting ahead of yourself, at least the way I manage my team, because so many players on my team are going to be moved in trades over the next 3 years. The reality is 3 years from now, the entirety of my team can be totally different. The other thing that's pushing his value down is the fact that he doesn't have a contract with Dallas. He's not inked and etched in stone to be the starting quarterback for them moving forward. But that narrative I also don't really understand, because he's going to be playing for a contract, or if somehow Jerry caves and they end up extending Dak for another 3 to 4 years, if Dak Prescott had a contract with the Cowboys for the next 3 to 4 years, there's absolutely no way that he should be valued here at quarterback 15. And when I start really digesting and thinking about this, Dak Prescott, you're telling me, is going to be playing for a contract more than likely this year. So we got a guy that has a ton of stats on his resume. We have a very accomplished fantasy quarterback that is going to be motivated to get a contract and play really well this season. We look at the Cowboys this year. They brought back Ezekiel Elliott, so they have the old corpse of him, as well as Rico Dowdle and a bunch of unproven players at the running back position. And this is a team that really chucked the ball a ton last year, in particular in the second half of the year. So I got a guy that's going to be motivated to put up a ton of stats in an offense that's going to be pass happy and also still has CeeDee Lamb attached to him. So if I project all that for one season, what he's likely going to do this year in Dallas, even if they somehow were to let him walk, which I really think when we start digging into this is incredibly unlikely to happen. But even then, if you tell me that he has a great season, even if he was to walk, you're telling me a 32-year-old Dak Prescott isn't going to be able to command a ton of money and have his pick of the litter as far as what teams are really shopping for quarterbacks next year? Dak Prescott, even if he's not playing for the Cowboys, is going to be a starting quarterback, I believe, for several years in this league. And if somehow before the season starts, he ends up inking a deal with Dallas, an extension would give him 2025 and 2026 at the minimum, very likely. At that point, Dak Prescott having 3 years within his range of outcomes with this contract. So it just makes no sense that he's going here. Now, with everyone going ahead of Dak, we can confidently project that they're going to be the starter, very likely, if not for sure, 3 seasons from now. So you're going to be getting that production from them, and you can probably project for most of them even past that. When I really start looking at this, how many of these guys can you confidently project not only will be the starter in 3 years, but that past 3 years, that their production 3 years from now is really going to be high end and meaningful? And when I think about it from that lens, one, I don't think we can really confidently project that for every single one of these players. And as well, how many of them have actually done anything for your teams? And let's even say that you have them for 3 years or more. What is that actually going to mean as far as production? Just because you have somebody for 5 years, if they're not giving you high-end points per game, you may just have an asset that you have for a long time. But if the scoring's middling, who cares if you have it for 5 years? And when we start comparing what Dak Prescott has done in his career, and especially what we saw last year from him, this is just crazy. So what I want to do is compare what Dak Prescott has done for our fantasy teams over a bigger sample size relative to some of these guys that are going ahead of him. If we look at the 309 and then at the 109, we got Joe Burrow. With Joe Burrow, we have a 4-year sample size of his career. Now, if you compare Joe Burrow's 4 years to the last 4 years of Dak Prescott, obviously it started at 2020. And for Joe Burrow, we can all acknowledge that year, he didn't have Jamar Chase yet. That team was terrible. They drafted him at 1 overall. They had basically no offensive line play, and he ended up getting hurt late in the year because of that. In his rookie season, he was 20 points per game, quarterback 18. Obviously in 2021, they draft Jamar Chase. We see a big step up in points per game. He's quarterback 12 at 22.7 points per game. In 2022, we had the big leap for Joe Burrow. This is the year they went to the Super Bowl. He was quarterback 4 in points per game that year and 26.3 points in 6-point per passing touchdown leagues. Obviously, this is where we saw Joe Burrow in the ceiling he can have and capture when all things are going right and clicking for the Cincinnati Bengals. This year, unfortunately, he had the calf injury early in the year, continued to want to play through that, ultimately didn't finish the year out, and was obviously injury riddled throughout the entire season. He was quarterback 24 on a points per game basis, 17.7. Let's acknowledge with Joe Burrow that there has been some inconsistency, but if we kind of throw those out the window for the sake of argument here, across 2021 and 2022, those years, he was giving you 25.1 fantasy points per game. They did draft Jermaine Burton. They lost Tyler Boyd. So let's even say that that ends up being a fine fix. I like the prospect of Jermaine Burton. What's going to happen here with T. Higgins, and how is this offense going to be moving forward? While Joe Burrow has had Jamar Chase in the year of 2021 and 2022, he's also had T. Higgins over that course, as well as Tyler Boyd. So with his weapons potentially not looking the same, is he still going to have this high-end upside? How realistic is it for him to overcome these circumstances? I'm not saying that we should be devaluing Joe Burrow. Certainly, I think Joe Burrow's an unbelievable talent, and I'm not saying he can't overcome the situation, but we've never really seen him have this situation that could be on the forefront if they don't extend and keep a guy like T. Higgins. Now, when we compare those side by side, Dak Prescott in 2020, he only played 5 5 games, but on a points per game basis, he was quarterback 1 overall during that time with 30.5 points per game. He was playing at an elite clip, and he was easily the best quarterback during the 4 games that he played the entirety of. In 2021, coming off of the injury, he was still quarterback 7 on a points per game basis, 24.7 points per game. Now let's acknowledge here this 2022 year is going to be the outlier for Dak Prescott, and I'm going to go over some reasons as to why that is. Quarterback 12 with 20.4 points per game. They had Tony Pollard and Ezekiel Elliott still, and this year actually with McCarthy, he was running the ball at a much higher rate and basically running the offense completely different. The Cowboys were actually number 19 in the NFL with pass attempts at only 556, and that offensive style in 2022 is nowhere near what they did in 2023 actually, and then obviously what we project going into 2024 without Tony Pollard anymore and a much older corpse of Ezekiel Elliott. And then last year in 2023, Dak Prescott was quarterback 3 on a points per game basis and finished at 24.4 fantasy points per game. And with him averaging roughly 25 fantasy points per game across those 3 years, and you compare it to Joe Burrow, even if we look at Joe Burrow and we say we are going to get that elite Joe Burrow that we saw in 2022 or 2021, if we're going to get the average of that, we're really not much better than 25 fantasy points per game. In the high-end range of outcomes we're looking at with him is probably in that 26, 27 fantasy points per game. We can't really confidently say that Dak Prescott doesn't have a chance to outscore Joe Burrow, and frankly, if I'm being honest, I think there's a better chance than not that he does outscore Joe Burrow in this 2024 season. With Dak Prescott, if you look at his season last year, it was really a tale of two halves. And if you use the bye as a differentiator, clearly the offense as a whole really started to shift in the way that they played and they utilized CeeDee Lamb in the way that they were throwing the football. Dak Prescott, after the bye, was a completely different monster, and this offense was passing at a huge rate and also was pushing the ball downfield significantly more than they were before the bye. Now, before the bye, they were really trying to establish Tony Pollard and were using him at an insane clip. And if you look at after the bye, over those final 11 weeks of the season, he cleaned the field pretty easily as far as production goes at 28.5 points per game. And if we bring 2019 into the fold, he was quarterback 4 with 24.9 fantasy points per game in that season. So what we've seen out of Dak Prescott recently, plus the way that we can kind of realistically project this offense to play this season, there's a better chance that Dak Prescott's a top 5 quarterback than he is finishing outside of the quarterback 1 territory. And you're drafting him at quarterback 15. You're drafting him as a quarterback 2. I basically can project this year that Dak Prescott has as good a chance as almost any fucking quarterback out there to be an elite points per game difference maker at the position. And even if it isn't with Dallas moving forward, he's only going to be 32 next year. And realistically, I can project confidently that he'll be playing somewhere else for 2 years, if not longer. And if I'm in a startup right now and I think about it from a sequencing standpoint, let's say I'm in that range, the 8th or 9th pick. At that spot, would you rather have a guy like Jamar Chase in the first round paired up with Dak Prescott? So Jamar Chase or Dak Prescott, or would you rather have Joe Burrow and Drake London? To me, it's easily the Dak and Jamar Chase side. Using some guys in similar ranges as examples as well, would you rather have Brandon Ayuk and Caleb Williams, or would you rather have Amon-Ra St. Brown and Dak Prescott? Again, for me, I'd rather have Dak Prescott and Amon-Ra St. Brown. And again, would you rather have Joe Burrow and Chris Olave, or would you possibly rather stack CeeDee Lamb and Dak Prescott? That one isn't even close for me, frankly. So when it comes to sequencing, I'd much rather have that elite receiver in the first round and pair that with Dak Prescott. Although I'm definitely foregoing some age from Joe Burrow, it's not enough for me to really care. And I think the elite production from those wide receivers that I feel confident with, I'd much rather have that security than I would the receivers that are not bad, by the way, Chris Olave, Brandon Ayuk, Drake London, but there's a lot less security and there's much less chance that those guys are truly elite difference makers at the position. But the other way around, I have a very good chance to have high finishers in points per game between the quarterback and the wide receiver position. When you compare Dak Prescott and what he's done from a production standpoint across a bunch of other players being drafted ahead of him, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. Trevor Lawrence at this point with 3 full seasons has been quarterback 38. 22 season, he was quarterback 13 in points per game. And then this year, he took a step back. We haven't even seen a quarterback 1 season out of him. So even if he does take this step forward, how meaningful is it really going to be relative to a guy like Dak Prescott? So while Trevor Lawrence is 24, who cares if for the next 3 years, Dak Prescott's destroying him in points per game? And if I think about Dak Prescott motivated and playing for a contract to stay with the Cowboys, and this year in particular from a historical perspective, there's only 2 quarterbacks the Cowboys have had that have thrown for more yards than Dak Prescott has at this point in his career. And there's a very realistic chance that he can catch both of them. He needs 34.83 to pass Troy Aikman. Also, if he gets to 36-65, he's going to pass Steve Young. Those ones, as long as he stays healthy, you can really confidently project that he's going to pass those two quarterbacks. And he's going to get very high on the leaderboard as far as all-time passing numbers at 47-24. If he's able to get to that point or higher to pass Tony Romo, first of all, if he's in that range, he's very likely to lead the NFL in passing yards based on what we saw last year, certainly be in the elite conversation as far as stats go. And if he does pass Tony Romo with an elite season, and now he's the all-time leading passer as far as yards go for the Cowboys, and they let him walk into free agency, it's going to be incredibly hard for them to let Dak Prescott walk. I honestly don't think it's going to happen. I think that Dak Prescott is realistically going to ink himself a deal with the Cowboys for at least the next 3 to 4 years. Why are we even caring about his age? Now, the second guy that's going to make this list for me, that's going to be turning 30 this year, and Jared Goff just got paid. He got a bag from Detroit in a great offensive situation with Jahmyr Gibbs, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta. People project J-Mo to take a step forward in this offense. So he has pass catchers and playmakers all around him, and he's going to be the play caller for Detroit based on his contract, at least through the 2027 season. Jared Goff, let's call it what it is. He's not likely to compete with Dak Prescott in that top 5 quarterback for the year, but Jared Goff realistically has a very safe floor. We can project him to be around for 3 to 4 seasons extremely confidently with this contract. And not only does he have that safe floor, he does have that back-end quarterback 1 upside. If we take a look at what he's produced for us across a lot of different situations, and arguably going into this next year, it's going to be the best situation that he's seen. And if we take a look at what Jared Goff realistically is, as far as 2018 was quarterback 9 on the year, 23.4 points per game. Obviously, that situation in LA was much different. Then in 2019 and 2020, teams really started to figure out Jared Goff and the way that he was playing, and Sean McVay became very frustrated with Goff over this time. He was quarterback 20 and quarterback 22, and then ultimately led to this massive trade of the Rams trading for Matt Stafford and Jared Goff going to Detroit. That 21 season, that offense as a whole was totally different than it is right now, and realistically was not a very good situation for a quarterback to be in. Jared Goff at that point, people didn't really think he was the long-term solution. He was kind of just packaged in the trade with Matt Stafford. Because they had to take on most of Jared Goff's salary, they ended up getting an additional first-round pick because of it. So to see what Jared Goff has done then in 2022 as the offense took a step forward, he was quarterback 13, 20.1 fantasy points per game in the 22 season. Last year in 23, again, quarterback 13 and 20.5 fantasy points per game. And when you look at Jared Goff over the course of the season and 6 point per passing touchdown, he finished at quarterback 7 because of all the attrition to the position. But Jared Goff realistically has an extremely safe floor and probably has back-end quarterback 1 upside, and you're drafting him at quarterback 17. So this one isn't quite as egregious, I don't think, as Dak Prescott. The way I view it with Jared Goff, if you aren't trying to pay a heavy price for your quarterback 2, or you really want to punt the position as a whole, Jared Goff I think is a very nice option if you have him as your quarterback 2 or super flex spot. If he is your quarterback 1, I think you can get by with that as long as you do have a second safe quarterback and the rest of your team is built very strong at the skill players. What keeps Jared Goff more in this safe range as opposed to being that upside type of player is simply the fact that he does not run. He's a statue back there. He's very unlikely to be more of a meaningful quarterback 1 in this Detroit Lions offense with Amon-Ra St. Brown, with Sam Laporta, with Jahmyr Gibbs. This is a guy that still can throw for well over 4,500 yards, and this offense is high potent, whether it's the name or the style of play that he has, combined with the way that we view his age in Dynasty. He's a value as well because the safety that you get on a guy like Jared Goff, although it isn't sexy and it doesn't sound great because he's going to be 30 this year, last 2 years in points per game, he's quarterback 13. Why do we care that much about age when we can confidently say he's going to be playing quarterback for the Lions at 34 years old? It's just silly to be valuing age that way at the quarterback position. So I'm not going to try to argue him ahead of many of the guys going in front of him, but the value that he offers at quarterback 17 in the late 4th or 5th round in startup, and a guy that you can get a lot of times for a single first round pick in future classes or a first with a little bit added on, he's a very safe option at the quarterback position that realistically isn't that far off in production from a lot of the guys being drafted higher than him, and also are going to take a significantly different price tag to acquire in Dynasty. In Superflex, it's really hard to find that type of stability at the quarterback position, especially at this price tag. The third guy that's going to make this list is basically because at this point, he's supposed to fail. He's basically free, going off the board at the 1308 in startups. But when you look at what he's going for in the trade market, if you take a look at a ton of trades that have gone down within the last couple weeks on Russell Wilson, and where a site like Keep Trade Cut actually has his dynasty value, he's already being valued outside the top 32 quarterbacks. So he's not even being valued as the quarterback 1 on his team. Pittsburgh doesn't have much financial investment in him at all. After Denver cut him last year, there's a loophole in his contract where if he signs the veteran minimum of $1.5 million, Denver basically would be on the hook for the entire contract because he wasn't going to get a bigger contract than what Denver owed him, take the vet minimum, and he decided to go to Pittsburgh. And when you take a look at Russell Wilson, I mean, I completely understand it, and I get why nobody wants him at this point. Justin Fields obviously now being the quarterback 2, waiting in the wings. Everybody wants to see Justin Fields take over. And let's just call it what it is. The simple truth is Russ over the last 2 seasons has not looked great, especially going back to that 2022 season with Nathaniel Hackett, his first year in Denver. That was his worst fantasy season by a long shot. Now this year you did see him start to get closer to the version that we saw in Seattle, but obviously he was not quite that. Denver was 7-8 with a chance to make the playoffs. With what little Russ had in this Denver offense relative to what we thought they were going to be, Judy simply just didn't live up to the expectations we kind of put out for him. Courtland Sutton was a red zone threat and jump ball receiver, but he can't really get separation. Javonte Williams got hurt, and the running back room didn't offer much as well. So Russell Wilson, given all that, and the fact that he's had coaching staff changes the last 2 years, so Nathaniel Hackett and then Sean Payton, and when I think about all that, and then I start really looking at what he's done for us in our fantasy teams the last couple years, and then in a bigger picture the last 3-4 seasons, it's actually a lot more surprising than you might think. When you factor all this in, Russ has not looked good the last 2 years. You got Arthur Smith now being the offensive coordinator for the Steelers. Realistically, everybody that plays Dynasty has to hate Arthur Smith. The way he utilized the weapons in Atlanta, plus how low passing volume this offense was over there. I completely understand how you combine him with Russell Wilson, and nobody wants any part of this. And this is why Russ goes to a 13th round pick, especially when you consider Justin Fields as the quarterback 2 and preying on his downfall. And we all just assume that at some point this year, Russell Wilson is going to continue to not look great, and they're going to cede the work from Russell Wilson, hand the keys over to Justin Fields because they traded and invested in him a late round pick. And at that point, Russell Wilson's going to be dead in Dynasty. I think that's kind of what the narrative is, and I certainly get it. And the truth is, his price already has him dead. He's going in startups near Khalil Shakir, Quentin Johnson, and Gus Edwards. None of those guys are appealing, and even lower value on keep trade cut and in the trade market. If Russell Wilson is dead halfway through the year or after this season, that's what you're paying for. So I kind of already expected that to be the case. But when I started to dig into Russell Wilson's numbers, the last couple seasons in Denver and then his final season in Seattle, looking at the numbers from a fantasy points per game perspective, there was a little more there than meets the eye, I think, for most people. And then as I started to dig deeper into this situation, given the fact that you can buy him really cheap right now, a late second and 25 certainly gets it done. I've seen him being traded a ton in the last 2 weeks in real trades for 3rd round picks. Russell Wilson is an asset that we all assume is going to crater. But when you start thinking about all that and how cheap he is, are you 100% sure, first of all, that Russell Wilson's not going to make it through the season as the starting quarterback for the Steelers? And then do you have any idea what he's actually done in fantasy points per game the last couple years? With Denver, Russell Wilson last year actually was quarterback 13 in points per game, 20.6 fantasy points per game, 2022, that offense with Nathaniel Hackett. Then he was quarterback 23 at 17.1 fantasy points per game. Not at all what we expected for Russell Wilson at the time. He was actually a 2nd round startup pick going into the 2022 season. People were really excited about this new situation in Denver. And now when you look at it again on the surface, Arthur Smith's in town and Russell Wilson at the quarterback position. A Russell Wilson pairing at this point in his career with Arthur Smith is enough to make anybody want to gag in their mouth and puke. I get it. And at this point, with Deontay Johnson leaving, George Pickens as the wide receiver 1 that we feel somewhat confident in, they drafted Roman Wilson, which for a lot of people wasn't really that great of a prospect, kind of an underwhelming name that they drafted in day 2. Pat Freiermuth had a very good rookie season, but really hasn't done much for us at all. And most of the options on this Pittsburgh offense haven't done much for us the last couple seasons because Kenny Pickett's been the quarterback for the Steelers, and we found out he was terrible. As much as I don't really want to, let's go ahead and dig into some of these Arthur Smith offenses the last 5 years, whether it was head coach for the Falcons the last 3 years or OC for the Titans in 2019 and 2020. These are very low pass volume offenses. 2023, 530 pass attempts with Ritter at the helm. 2022, only 415 pass attempts. Go to 2021, his first year in Atlanta when Matt Ryan was still there. They moved on from Julio Jones the year prior. Matt Ryan without Julio Jones, they actually threw the ball 573 times, but Matt Ryan was very inefficient in that offense. You go back to 2019 and 2020, when he was the OC for the Tennessee Titans. In those offenses, they were run first, obviously with Derrick Henry. 485 pass attempts in 2020, 448 pass attempts in 2019. So obviously when you look at this, considering the fact that we don't think very highly of Russell Wilson right now, this kind of looks like a recipe for disaster as far as Russell Wilson and his fantasy production goes, let alone thinking the bigger picture in Dynasty. Now I get it, but just stick with me on this. So what situations has Russell Wilson been in the last 5 years relative to what we've seen from Arthur Smith? When we take a look at what he's done in the offenses he's been in, Sean Payton in this Denver offense last year, 513 pass attempts. 2 years ago, Nathaniel Hackett, 571 pass attempts for Denver. Go to 2021, his last year in Seattle, 495 pass attempts. 2020, 500 563 pass attempts, and in 2019, 517 pass attempts. When I'm looking at these 5 seasons comparatively for Russell Wilson and Arthur Smith, side by side, what I'm looking at overall is that these are low passing volume offenses as a whole. None of these offenses came in with the idea of they're going to chuck the ball around and throw a ton. All of these offenses were really run-first offenses. And then when you take a look at Russell Wilson and his whole career, there was obviously chatter when he was playing really well in Seattle for let Russ cook. They wanted the passing volume to go up and see what Russell Wilson could do because he was so efficient on low touches. Russell Wilson, through his entire career, has been a quarterback that's been on offenses and throwing the ball in that 400 to mid 500 range. When Russell Wilson has been at his peak, it wasn't because the passing volume was really high. Arthur Smith is coming in and going to be running an offense which is run first. That's not really any different than what we've seen from Russell Wilson throughout his career, the good or bad version of Russell Wilson, truthfully. In the quarterback play that the Falcons had the last 3 years, now we don't think highly of Russell Wilson, but he's probably a better option than anything they had in Atlanta the last 3 years. Now, when you go back to Arthur Smith and him being the OC for the Titans, but let's remember that just because you're a good offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator, there are certain coordinators that when trying to make the step up to being a head coach, they don't actually translate that well being a head coach, but that doesn't mean that they can't be a very good offensive coordinator. And now when you look at Arthur Smith and his time as an OC in Tennessee, obviously they still had King Henry at his peak in his prime. So this is a team that you should be running the ball first with, even in this low passing volume offense that ran through Derrick Henry and a ton of play action. Remember that he really revived Ryan Tannehill's career at that point. Ryan Tannehill, after being in Miami, had one season where he was a top 12 quarterback, but overall was looking like a bust. Ryan Tannehill then ends up going to be the backup. Mariota was still the starter when Arthur Smith took over in 2019. Ryan Tannehill stepped in to be the starter. At this point, Ryan Tannehill, also not a sexy name, and people don't like to hear it. In 2019, when Ryan Tannehill was on the field, he was quarterback 9 on a points per game basis, 23.2 fantasy points per game. In the 2020 season, when Ryan Tannehill was a starter for the full season, he was quarterback 11 in points per game and quarterback 8 overall for the year, 25.6 fantasy points per game in that 2020 season. And it was actually when Arthur Smith left that Ryan Tannehill did not look anywhere near as good and did not put up the stats and finishes that he did when Arthur Smith was the OC. And while nobody wants to hear that, when I look at Arthur Smith and the way he wants to run things, what Russell Wilson's accustomed to, and then ultimately this team in Pittsburgh, which with Mike Tomlin has never had a losing record. At minimum, they've been 500, whether that's with Pickett and terrible quarterback play at the helm. Russell Wilson, realistically, at this point in his career, not making anything against the Pittsburgh cap is going to allow them to put money into all the other positions. They've drafted a bunch of offensive linemen, first, second, and fourth round this year. Follow that up with first round linemen last year. The offensive line that we saw with Kenny Pickett in 22 versus what we're seeing this year, I think could be very different. And as a Browns fan, I really hate to say this and even talk about Pittsburgh and Arthur Smith and all this as much as I am. But if this offensive line takes a step forward and becomes at least average, if not possibly an above average offensive line this year, you look at Najee Harris and Jalen Warren coming out of the backfield, and you look at Russell Wilson, who has been very good over his career with play action, and you pair him up with Arthur Smith through play action and running the ball first, is going to set up a lot of situations where Russell Wilson, off of that play action, who's very good at throwing deep balls and contested catches to a guy like George Pickens. You could see a situation where Russell Wilson actually in this offense is very similar to what we saw last year in Denver, but this team's better, and this offensive situation's better, and the OC of Arthur Smith, while we hate to admit it, could very well be great for him, much like we saw with Ryan Tannehill. You're not super excited to watch it, but if the points per game come at this cheap in Dynasty, if he doesn't pan out, that's what you're paying for. And if this team is winning games and Russell Wilson isn't turning the ball over at a high clip or taking sacks too much, there's not necessarily a reason for them to give the keys to Justin Fields. If Russell Wilson ends up this year giving us points per game in that 15 to 18 range, or even closer to that quarterback 13 that we saw last year, not only is he going to be a value, he's basically free. At this point, if you don't have a very solid quarterback 2, and you want to add him as a speculative quarterback 3 or a backup option, I think realistically for the price, there's a lot more upside than we want to give it credit for. While we all certainly know the downsides, and that's baked into the fact that he is valued at quarterback 33, what if he ends up being the starting quarterback for the Steelers for the full season? And what if this team that's well coached is actually competent and makes the playoffs? He's probably not going to command a ton in free agency, and then there's a chance that the Pittsburgh Steelers actually bring him back at somewhat of a reasonable price tag. Now, with all that said, one of the main reasons I'm bringing him up is obviously because of his price. And you take a look at some real deals that have gone down for Russell Wilson and what it probably costs to acquire a guy at this point that everybody's leaving for dead. But at this type of cost of acquisition, even though he is 35, if I was able to get even a full season out of Russell Wilson, that's a win. And God forbid that he ends up being a starter next year, at this price, I can't really pass it up. Look at some of these deals that have gone down. Russell Wilson or Rondale Moore and Drew Lock. At this point in the career of Rondale Moore and Drew Lock, these are hopes and prayers. Russell Wilson or the 311 in this class. And listen, I like this class quite a bit, but at the 311, I mean, this is a dart throw. J.K. Dobbins and Juju Smith-Schuster. At this point, we've seen that Juju is a complete shell of himself, and J.K. Dobbins coming off a second significant injury. Realistically, this is name cachet. I'll take Russell Wilson in this deal. In a Superflex league, Russell Wilson's upside, just being the starter in the Steelers offense, even if it doesn't come to fruition, is worth at least a 311. And if Russell Wilson actually gets this team to the playoffs, which for those that don't remember, they actually were the 7th seed and made it to the playoffs last year, Russell Wilson at this point in Superflex is going to be a value. And whether you want to hear it or not, when you look at the range of outcomes, Russell Wilson could 100% flame out. Justin Fields could be the quarterback pretty early on in the season. Certainly that is the worst end range of outcomes. And at that point, you've probably burned a future third or even 2/3. But if Russell Wilson ends up being the starter for the full season, he could end up giving you points per game in that quarterback 13 to 18 range, in which you paid almost nothing for him. And speaking to the whole point of the video with age, there's absolutely a realistic scenario where whether it's in Pittsburgh or somewhere else, Russell Wilson ends up being a starting quarterback next year, and he offers you a similar range of outcomes because of the way that we view him and his age being 35. We're leaving him for dead as if he has no chance to keep this starting job this year. But just know that it's going to be very hard, almost impossible, to find a quarterback with this type of pedigree in this type of situation where we've seen him actually matter and be meaningful in points per game this cheap. So that's why Russell Wilson rounds out this list, because of age and perception that we have just way too cheap in Dynasty. And that's all I got. Let me know what you thought of this video. Did you like going over the Dynasty landscape and the quarterback position as a whole? Did you like or not like talking about quarterback vets? Let me know all that down in the comments, and I'll see you back here, same time, same place, talking more Dynasty strategy and trades. I'm out of here. Peace.